Welcome to the Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast from Blick Rothenberg, the tax, accounting and business advisory firm. This week with Robert Salter and Tom Goddard.
Welcome to the Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast. I'm Robert Salter.
And I'm Tom Goddard.
And we're here to talk about tax and part of the Tax Factor. And obviously, there's been plenty going on in the last week or so from a tax perspective. So whether you're excited by thoughts of the budget coming along the line or looking at Keir Starmer's tax affairs or whatever, there's plenty going on. Tom, welcome back after your debut a few weeks ago. What do you find making the headlines this week?
The Tax Factor. Headlines.
Once again, we're going to have to mention this £30 billion fiscal black hole that Chancellor Rachel Reeves is going to have to address. So the latest rumour is that VAT will be increased in order to address this. With the PM and the Chancellor both not ruling out increases, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Wes Streeting, then also came out and stated that VAT would not be introduced on private healthcare. What we can take from this, however, is that, in fact, VAT is being looked at by the Revenue, and quite rightly, as increasing the standard rate from 20 to 21% would raise or could raise an additional £8.8 billion, according to HMRC's own figures. The Chancellor is also reportedly considering measures such as raising taxes on betting firms and possibly changing national insurance. But as always, given the reaffirmation that the manifesto stands, we're all keen to know exactly where all of this money is going to come from. What I do, however, want to reiterate, which I previously mentioned in my podcast with Nimesh a few weeks ago, is that I believe this leaking of rumours by the Treasury as a way of dictating tax policy through public reaction should, in fact, actually be condemned. I think the Chancellor is doing well at maintaining a sense of fiscal responsibility by aiming to cut spending and raise taxes where required, but the overall procedure, I think, should be looked at here. And finally, the UK is facing further potential downgrades in productivity forecasts, which I also reported in my monthly HMRC receipts article. In response, the Treasury are exploring tax reforms aimed at stimulating economic growth and avoiding a fiscal shortfall exceeding £10 billion. Proposals include simplifying the tax code, adjusting VAT thresholds, and revising stamp duty to incentivise investment.
Yeah, I think overall, Tom, it's one of those things where I generally don't think the government really has a understanding where it wants to go from a wider perspective, from a tax strategy perspective. And obviously, when it came in, and it still does, talk about economic growth, and economic growth at the end of the day is going to have to be a vital part of any revenue increases for the government so it can fund investment in the NHS or the increased defence spending or whatever. And I don't generally think it has an idea of how to do that. And it's also let itself be hamstrung by the commitments it made in the manifesto, and it still obviously isn't 100% comfortable going against those. I suspect actually come November, when we do have the budget, they will have actually probably gone back a bit on those manifesto commitments, and in some way, shape or form, they will change things. So whether that's, for example, widening the scope of NIC, so you may not increase it overall, so the official rates that are there for employees and self-employed, for example, may not change, but then you may put it on letting income, for example, or something like that. In some way, shape or form, I think there's going to be additional taxes. And when we look at this, NIC, VAT, income tax are the biggest government earners, for want of a better term. So those are the things they will have to look at in some way, shape or form. May we live in interesting times.
I think it's a good point. I mean, there's certain things the Chancellor can do with regards to, the big three taxes of national insurance, VAT and income tax, without explicitly breaking the manifesto pledges that they stated. As you quite rightly said, that the ways that they can do this is expanding sort of the scope of VAT or issuing national insurance on lettings fees. So it'd be interesting to see what the Chancellor does, because flirting around with these other taxes, such as IHT, I don't think is going to generate the revenue in order to fill this 30 billion black hole that we've been seeing.
The reality is things like IHT are quite small taxes. So IHT at the moment gets 6 or 7 billion a year. You may be able to increase that a bit. You may increase it to 10 billion. Well, that's only going to be an extra 3 billion. Doesn't cover the 30 billion, which is the alleged black hole fiscally. It might make a bit of a difference. It might mean you don't have to put NIC or VAT up quite as much, or it may be a small part of Mr. Leaves' solution to the fiscal black hole, but it's definitely not the total position in any way, shape or form. So I think it's going to be a very limited part of any solution.
I'm sure you would have seen as well, it's not just this £30 billion black hole that Rachel is trying to generate revenue for. We've seen proposals about how they want to remove the two-child benefit cap, which is going to cost a reported £2 to £3 billion on top of this fiscal black hole, where they're going to have to get the revenue from somewhere.
So it's either increasing taxes elsewhere or having a spending cut somewhere else. Like I say, there's only so much money out there, and fundamentally we can't print money. Around the edges you can increase borrowing a wee bit or something like that, but it doesn't provide any long-term definitive solution. You have to try and have growth to make sure your tax and your spending are in some sort of alignment. No easy wins for Mr. Leaves there, and I have to say I wouldn't want to be working in the Treasury at the moment.
No, I think you're quite right. I know it's difficult for us to address every rumour that we see in the papers regarding what may come this November.
Okay, well, thanks. And we're 6 weeks in now, and we've still had no chocolate VAT story. It's very disappointing.
I just wanted to change tack slightly and talk about a recent story regarding the Prime Minister's personal affairs that we've been seeing in the papers. As listeners will be aware, there's been a lot of noise regarding Keir Starmer and this land that he brought for his parents. I believe it was for rescue goats at the back of their
donkeys, I believe.
That's the one, yeah. Donkeys. Seemingly, this is in line with a lot of news reporting that we've been witnessing with regards to MPs' personal situations. We had all of the news stories coming out about Angela Rayner. I believe Nigel Farage had some questions about some of his personal affairs and some properties with his partner. But what we can see from the news is that media has suggested that there was a trust in place and that tax avoidance is at play here. I think before going into the details of this, it is important just to clarify there is a distinction between tax avoidance, which is completely fine, and tax evasion, which absolutely is not and illegal. So the media is saying there is a trust. However, Keir Starmer last weekend, I believe, spoke about this and addressed it whilst in an interview with Laura Kusenberg, stating explicitly that this wasn't a trust. If we look at the background, Keir Starmer bought this field back in 1996, which he allowed his parents to enjoy the benefit of for their lifetime. On the death of his parents, the land would revert back to him. Therefore, the land would remain outside of his parents' taxable estate for IHT purposes. Hence, on the face of it, and I'd like to get your views on this, Robert, this is absolutely a trust, and more specifically, I believe, a lifetime trust. I think it's sensible tax planning. If Keir Starmer had granted it to his parents directly, it would fall within their taxable estate. However, with this lifetime trust, the IHT charge now falls on Prime Minister's estate, therefore delaying the IHT charge.
I think it is a trust. I think one of the things that, and I think Keir Starmer's perhaps been simplistic, shall we say, in the use of his language, because as a lawyer, he should know you don't have to have lots of paperwork in place or anything like that to create a trust. So I do think there is a trust here. You know, you give somebody a lifetime interest in something, just because you haven't backed it up with paperwork does not mean you don't have a trust. They specifically call it a bare trust, i.e. it's just a promise to each other, but it still can be legally binding in effect and things like that. So I do think we've got a trust. I actually think there's nothing wrong with that. And it's actually, I think, counterproductive when people pick up on people being tax efficient and tax sensible with things. We would certainly have advised clients to sensibly, if you don't want to really give this to your parents, you want to keep your rights to it and everything like that, to do it in this way. Potentially, if we hadn't done it in this way, there's other issues that could arise and things like that from a tax perspective. So he hasn't done anything wrong. Lots of people, if they've got the money to buy a field like this for their parents or whatever, would have probably done something very similar. It's perfectly valid. In the same way, certainly one or two of the issues associated they raised with Nigel Farage in terms of the work he does for GB News, for example, it may well have been totally correct in terms of what happened. We don't know enough about the kind of the employment type arrangement that he has as a presenter, to what extent he's self-employed, what extent he's employed, etc. But it is worth raising these things from a media perspective, and to some extent, this is what we're doing. But let's be clear on what's happening and highlight, as you've said previously, that there's a massive difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. And anybody who says, oh, we should never do tax avoidance if you're a politician, well, they get tax relief on their pension contributions. That's, in effect, tax avoidance. You're totally changing the tax point. And that's absolutely legitimate. It's what's designed. It's, the law totally allows it. No different really here. So yes, the asset involved is different, and lots of us can't afford fields, etc., me included. But fundamentally, I don't think anything's been done wrong incorrectly here. So I think it's a bit sad when we pick up on politicians for things which are not or should not be controversial.
No, I completely agree. I'm also just wondering if the fact that Keir Starmer denied that there was a trust might be due to the connotations that a trust structure has and the voter, Labour's typical voters, and viewing a trust as something that's not really in tune with their beliefs. But I'm not sure we'll get the answer to that.
We won't get the answer to that. No, we won't get the answer to that. And like I say, I think he could have perhaps defended the arrangement more strongly, because I think it is a perfectly valid arrangement. And like I say, lots of Labour supporters, lots of Tory supporters, if they had the chance of doing this, they would absolutely do the same thing, and they would not regard it as controversial or anything like that. So let's be honest, it's quite a standard type of arrangement. Why try and hide it? Why try and fudge it? Why try and pretend it didn't happen or it isn't X or Y?
I believe recent reports indicate that his parents' estate was within their exempt amounts anyway. So all of this planning and isn't there a trust, had no enduring material benefit for IHT regardless.
Yeah, and like I say, he did a perfectly sensible thing, and there's actually quite possibly various other reasons he might have done it for. Again, people always think of trust as tax avoidance, tax planning. In many cases, you do it for quite a lot of other reasons as well.
We'll see if anything comes to light. Anyway, moving on, and time, and forgive me for this pun, time to punt the politics and tackle something a little lighter, with the NFL coming to London this weekend with the Minnesota Vikings, who played in Dublin last weekend, taking on the Cleveland Browns. However, on the tax factor, we're always looking for a tax angle, and I understand you, Robert, have been taking a look into this.
Yes, so obviously there's often a perception amongst the general public that a business trip, for example, to the UK has no tax implications, and that is very often correct. So certainly, for example, if I went to Germany for a week's business trip, meeting a few potential clients or whatever, I would not expect to be taxed on that in 95% of cases. However, you can feel sorry for NFL players here and pop stars as well, if you wanted to look at them, because the regulations for them are totally different. So the reality is the protection which is available for want of a better term, normal people when it comes to work days in a third country don't apply for sports people, don't apply for pop stars and dancers, musicians, etc., etc. So the reality is these NFL players will be taxable. So HMRC will get a bit of a win here from the fact that they have to work in the UK for a day. Now, clearly, they won't work in the UK for just a day. They'll probably spend 3, 4, 5 days here, including the preparation and things like that. HMRC will be able to tax the earnings associated with that. So there's a bit of a win for the UK government, and doesn't quite kind of cover the 30 billion black hole we were talking about before, but every little bit helps, I suppose.
You'll forgive me if I'm not overly sympathetic for these NFL players based on their salary packages that I have been seeing.
Yeah, I would say, though, there is almost like 2 levels of NFL player. There's the star quarterbacks who certainly can earn 50 million a year, plus various endorsement figures and things like that. And some of that endorsement money might also be UK taxable in some cases. Whilst you get then lots of, say, special team players who only, inverted commas, earn, a few $100,000 a year. And obviously the other side of the NFL, it does actually stand for the not for long league. So the average career of an NFL player is, I think, about 3 years. You all hear about the Tom Bradys who had 20 plus years at the top and things like that, but that's not most players. So I think it is a very hard league, and it's not a particularly secure job.
I think you're quite right there. So these NFL players will have UK reporting obligations then, and will have to file a tax return, no doubt.
Yes, almost certainly they'll have to file a tax return. You may find 1 or 2 of them, for example, on the very low paid element, may actually have no liability because they maybe have a British passport, an EU passport somewhere down the line or something like that. But 99% of them will have actual tax liability and have to file an actual tax return. Realistically, they'll have agents to manage a lot of that for them, I'd hope.
Very interesting. Here's hoping the Minnesota Vikings are victorious. That's not a plug. That's just simply based on my fantasy team. And finally, HMRC held their stakeholder conference a couple of weeks ago, with them identifying 3 key strategic priorities, namely improving customer experience, closing the tax gap, and reformation and modernisation of the tax system. Making tax digital and AI were key drivers of the conference, along with being stricter on the standards for tax advisors like yourself and I. Just wondering whether you had picked up anything from the conference at all.
I certainly think it is correct for HMRC to continue to try and improve, and it's definitely correct that they interact with tax advisors. And I have no particular problem with the fact that they are trying to regulate tax advisors because, that needs to be done. Now, there will be a problem because some of these people will be offshore or whatever. So there will be the cowboys that they can't touch, but that's life. You focus on what you can do. But I do think that one of the comments coming out of it was obviously they needed to work with tax advisors as part of improving the tax profession and getting a better service in effect for clients and customers, and making sure that, the system worked more holistically and effectively and efficiently. But then if you look at one of the kind of niche areas I deal with, it's national insurance for international employees, for example. Literally a week or so ago, HMRC announced changes to how they believe national insurance for international employees on things like trailing cash bonuses should be calculated. Now, the position they've taken there goes against well-established precedent, and they haven't come up with any kind of clear legal basis for the change. And the profession has definitely asked consistently, okay, we're happy to change, but where's the basis for it? When you did some other changes to national insurance and how it's calculated, for example, on stock options, you changed the law because you realized you couldn't just do this unilaterally. They're meant to be working with us as a profession, and they just have, in effect, changed the law without any clear legal basis for it. So that will cause some hiccups and challenges for clients. It might create double liabilities in many cases. And I think the real difficulty is HMRC is talking about going back 6 years. So if they audited a company, for example, and the company's done it on the traditional basis for calculating NIC for their international employees, they will say, hang on, that's incorrect, and here's the demand. Now, that isn't, to my mind, working with customers. It isn't working with the profession. It's kind of like trying to almost like impose something. The silly thing is as well, when you actually look at this on a go-forward basis, it's very questionable as to what actually they will gain, because there will definitely be a lot of people and a lot of companies that lose, but there's going to be a lot of other companies that win. So if you have more people coming into the UK, for example, and they've earned bonuses in many cases overseas, in many cases traditionally you would have had to NIC that fully. Now you may only be able to necessarily NIC a part of it or something like that. So it's literally like creating difficulty for customers. They will have to change their payroll processes in many places and ways, try and capture additional data, and it increases them to potential risks and the double charges and everything. So it's creating, I'll say chaos, well, that's perhaps a bit too strong, but certainly additional difficulty, additional confusion, and it doesn't obviously create any win for anybody. So like I say, certainly the core noise that comes out of HMRC from the stakeholder conference, the aims and everything, lots and lots of positive things there, but it also then has to be operationalized and actually become the reality of what they do. And I'm not sure we're there yet.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be watching with bated breath to see whether these promises that HMRC are making actually come into fruition. I know the UK tax codes and laws surrounding it terribly complex. I'm sure you know better than I about that. So whether there's any room for HMRC to simplify this through the use of AI or new technologies coming out is one that we will watch and hope for.
Touch wood, as they say.
Touch wood.
Or touch my head, which is basically wood.
Blick Rothenberg, celebrating 80 years.
Thank you, Robert. Before we go, just to mention, it's Blick Rothenberg's 80th anniversary, and to celebrate, we've created 3 special episodes of The Tax Factor. Each one takes you back to a different decade in tax history, but told in the style of the broadcasting of the time. So, for the 1940s, we've gone full newsreel, with the classic cinema voice bringing the tax headlines of the day in The Taxation Factor. Then it's into the 1960s for a pirate radio takeover, packed with the spirit and sound of swinging radio Tax Factor. And finally, the 1980s, reimagined as a commercial London talk radio station, Tax Factor FM 97.2.
You can listen to all of these 3 special tax podcasts on the Blick Rothenberg website or your usual podcast platform. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. But it's goodbye from me, and have a good weekend.
Goodbye.
That's the Tax Factor. Since launching in August 2023, we've become the UK's top tax podcast in the UK podcast chart. Join us every Friday for expert insight on the latest tax news. Subscribe on your preferred podcast platform or listen direct on the Blick Rothenberg website, where you can also find the latest updates and analysis. The Tax Factor from Blick Rothenberg. Copyright 2025.